They fined me for my grass. They wrote me up for a flower pot. They even measured my dog's leash. The HOA thought they owned the neighborhood, but what they didn't know, I owned the land that powered their precious lake. So I flipped a switch and turned the whole neighborhood upside down. Willow Ridge Estates looked like the kind of place you'd see on a real estate brochure or one of those lifestyle magazines at the dentist's office. Perfect rows of houses with 3-car garages, green lawns trimmed to military precision, and flower beds that seemed to bloom in perfect coordination. At the center of it all was a sparkling, man-made like a calm, mirror-like body of water that reflected the pastel sunset skies and made the whole neighborhood look like a screensaver. That lake was the reason I bought the house. I'll admit, I was smitten. I'd worked hard for years, saved every dime I could, and when the opportunity came to move into a place with lakefront views, I didn't hesitate. It felt like I was buying more than a home. I was buying peace, a sanctuary. The realtor gave me the usual speech: low crime, quiet neighbors, great HOA that keeps everything running like clockwork. Back then, I heard that last part and thought it was a bonus. I thought the homeowners association would be my ally. I was wrong. My house sat right on the edge of the lake. I had a small dock out back and a view that made every morning feel like a vacation. The lake itself wasn't natural lit, was maintained by an underground pump and filtration system, operated by a utility room on the far edge of the neighborhood. The HOA controlled that, along with everything else: the landscaping schedule, the color of your mailbox, even what kind of blinds you could hang in your windows. At first, it seemed a small price to pay for the view. The first few months went smoothly. I introduced myself to neighbors, attended a couple of HOA meetings, just to show my face, and paid my dues on time. I didn't want to rock the boat. I just wanted to enjoy the water, walk my dog, grill on weekends, and mind my own business. But if you've ever lived under an HOA, you know that minding your own business is practically a sin in their eyes. The first letter came in a cream-colored envelope with the HOA logo stamped on the top. Friendly reminder. It began that your trash can was visible from the street on a non-collection day. Future violations will result in fines. I shook my head, rolled my eyes, and moved on. Maybe I left it out. No big deal, right? Wrong. The second letter came 2 weeks later. This time it was about a flower pot. Yes, a flower pot. It was apparently not in compliance with community aesthetic standards because it was turquoise, instead of one of the 3 pre-approved earth tones listed in the HOA handbook. That was the first time I laughed out loud at one of their letters. I almost thought it was a joke. Then came the warnings about my dog's leash, length too long, the welcome mat on my porch too brightly colored, and the fact that I'd installed solar lights along my walkway without prior architectural approval. It was like they were watching me through binoculars, and maybe they were. Still, I tried to play along. I swapped out the flower pot, shortened the leash, and removed the lights. I told myself, pick your battles. But then came the grass situation. I travel a lot for work. Sometimes I'm gone a week at a time, and while I pay for lawn service, there was one stretch during a rainy week when the grass grew a little too fast. Nothing crazy, maybe a ½ inch above regulation, but that was all it took. I came home to a fine taped to my door. Not mail tape. Bold red letters screamed grass height violation, $125, due immediately. The HOA board had sent someone to measure it, literally measure it, like it was some kind of golf course inspection. That was the moment I stopped laughing. I went to the next HOA meeting with the fine in hand and questions on my tongue. But the board members didn't want to hear it. They hid behind bylaws and policies, cut me off mid-sentence, and gave me looks like I was the problem for even speaking up. I left that meeting feeling like I'd just tried arguing with a brick wall, and that's when I started digging. I read the HOA's rules, front to back, highlighted inconsistencies, and even pulled property records and water maintenance reports. That's when I learned something very interesting. You see, the beautiful, glittering lake at the heart of Willow Ridge, was maintained using a private system that drew from a series of underground pumps and electrical circuits. And according to the records, the land housing those pumps didn't actually belong to the HOA, it belonged to me. Well, not me, exactly, but the original property developer had subdivided the land oddly. When I bought my house, I unknowingly purchased a tiny sliver of land on the south end of the neighborhood, the land where the utility shack sat. No one paid attention to it because it looked like an easement or utility zone. But legally, I owned the ground it stood on, and that included the electrical access panel that powered the lake pump. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with that information. I wasn't trying to play God with the neighborhood's ecosystem, but as the HOA's letters and fines escalated, I started seeing it not as a weapon but as leverage. I sent a letter of my own, a polite one. It pointed out the land deed, the location of the pump, and the fact that the HOA was technically trespassing every time they sent someone to service it. I asked for a meeting to discuss cooperation. They ignored me, so I sent a second letter, certified this time. I included photos of the property lines and a copy of the deed. I said if I didn't receive a response within 10 business days, I would be forced to secure my property and restrict access to unauthorized personnel. They responded not with a meeting request, but with a cease and desist order. They accused me of attempting to extort the HOA, violating community standards, and threatening public property. Public property. That was rich. I had the papers in hand that said otherwise. I didn't respond. I waited. Then one evening, just before sunset, I walked down to the pump shack. I used my key to open the box, flipped 3 switches, and turned off the main power breaker. Within 24 hours, the lake began to drain. Asterisk. The morning after I shut off the pump, the neighborhood didn't immediately panic. The surface of the lake was still, like always. But by midday, the difference was obvious. The water line had receded just enough to expose a muddy edge near the shore, and the birds that usually skimmed across the surface were absent. By the second day, the smell hit. Without circulation, the water started to stagnate. Algae bloomed. Mosquitoes buzzed in the air like they'd been summoned by some swamp witch. Lawn chairs sat abandoned. Joggers detoured around the lake path. And by the third day, the first email went out from the HOA. Dear residents, it read, we are aware of an issue affecting the lake's filtration system. We are working diligently to resolve it. No mention of me, not yet. They still thought I was bluffing. But the thing is, I wasn't bluffing. I was just done being bullied. They sent a maintenance crew on day 4, some poor guys in safety vests with a truck full of tools. I watched from my backyard as they scratched their heads in front of the locked pump house. One of them pulled out a phone. Less than an hour later, a board member showed up, Martin, the vice president of the HOA, clean cut, always in khakis, and a guy who walked like he thought he owned the sidewalk. I met him at the gate. He tried to keep things civil at first. I understand there's been some confusion about this parcel of land, he said, holding a folder under his arm like it was a badge. No confusion on my end, I replied, holding up my own folder. You're standing on private property. Mine? His smile faltered just a little. Martin said they had documents proving HOA jurisdiction. I asked to see them. What he had were copies of community guidelines and landscaping regulations, a single deed or legal document referencing ownership of the utility land. I showed him my deed. It was legitimate, certified, and stamped by the county clerk. Even if that's the case, Martin said, flipping through the pages without really reading them, you can't just shut off a shared amenity. It's a violation of community trust. I raised an eyebrow. So is fining people $125 for grass. He didn't like that. We'll take legal action, he said flatly. Be my guest, I said. In the meantime, you're trespassing. He left, red-faced, and the workers followed. I thought that might buy me some peace, but I underestimated how petty an HOA could be. Within a week, I got slapped with a notice from the city, something about unpermitted landscaping modifications. Apparently, someone had reported that I was altering the shoreline. A ridiculous claim, but enough to trigger a formal inspection. Then came the code enforcement officer, who just happened to be in the area, and cited me for minor cracks in my driveway. Then the city sanitation department said they had a report about improper water runoff from my property. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. The HOA was trying to drown me in bureaucracy, but they had underestimated my patience. And my printer, I documented everything. Every visit, every letter, every interaction. I responded to each complaint with evidence, receipts, and photographs. I stayed polite, professional, and just annoying enough that no city department could make a charge stick. I wasn't just fighting back, I was winning. Meanwhile, the lake looked worse every day. The water level dropped nearly 2 feet. The HOA tried installing temporary pumps, but they didn't have access to the underground system, which was more complex than they realized. Algae covered most of the surface by week 3. Residents began complaining. The once idyllic walking trail was now a mosquito-ridden mud loop. Property values dipped. Realtors stopped including lake views in their listings. And then, one night, I got a knock on the door. It was Ms. Harris, one of the original residents, probably in her 70s. Always wore big sunglasses and like she was on vacation in her own backyard. She didn't say much, just stood there with her arms crossed. You turned off the lake? She asked. I nodded. I did. She looked around for a moment, then said, good. That was it. Just, good. Then she walked off. And that was when I realized, not everyone loved the HOA. In fact, more people started coming forward. Quietly at first, a neighbor across the street dropped off cookies with a note that said, thank you for standing up to them. Another sent me an email with stories about how the HOA had fined her for repainting her fence without pre-approved beige. It was like I had accidentally become a symbol. The guy who said no, the guy who flipped the switch, that didn't sit well with the board. They called an emergency HOA meeting in the community center. I went, of course, and so did about 30 other residents, way more than usual. Martin was there, along with Susan, the president. She always spoke like she was running a fortune. 500 company instead of bossing around a neighborhood. They tried to spin it like I was endangering the community. They called it vandalism, negligence, malicious property sabotage. But I stood up, cool as ice, and held up my deed. This is my land. That pump sits on my property, and you never had permission to build there. You never paid a lease. You never had a contract. So when you say I'm endangering the lake, remember, I'm the only one who's kept it running this whole time. I just stopped because you stopped listening. Silence. Then, someone in the crowd clapped. Just one, then two, then almost everyone. The board didn't have a rebuttal. The meeting adjourned early. But I knew it wasn't over yet. The HOA doesn't just back down. They regroup. They strategize. They look for new angles. So I started preparing for what would come next. I got legal counsel, drafted letters. I even had a licensed surveyor come out to recertify the boundary lines, just in case they tried to dispute them, because if they wanted to make this a war, I was ready to fight it all the way. They pushed me, and I pushed back by pulling the plug. By the fourth week, the lake was a ghost of its former self. What used to be the crown jewel of the neighborhood had become a muddy pit. Ducks disappeared. Fish floated belly up. Homeowners who once bragged about waterfront views were now closing their blinds in embarrassment. The HOA was officially in crisis mode. But the strangest thing, I felt calm for the first time in months. I wasn't anxious every time I checked my mailbox. I wasn't walking on eggshells. I had drawn a line, and more importantly, I had held it. And while the HOA was scrambling, something even more unexpected was happening. People started talking to each other, not just small talk or awkward waves on trash day, but real conversations. It started with backyard whispers, then full-blown porch huddles. We were comparing stories, laughing at the absurdity, and for the first time since I moved in, it felt like we were a real community. Not because of the HOA, but in spite of it. Then came the letter that changed everything, that arrived on official HOA letterhead, but this one wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. The board wanted to meet, not in some community center under fluorescent lights but at my house. In person, they'd finally realized that legal threats weren't going to scare me. I agreed, but under one condition. The meeting would be recorded. They didn't like it, but they said yes. The next afternoon, 3 board members showed up. Susan the president, Martin the VP, and a third guy I'd never met who looked like he wished he were anywhere else. I had my phone recording on the patio table. They sat stiffly in their polos and boat shoes, glancing toward the pump shack like it was a hostage in a standoff. Susan started with an apology, or something that sounded like one. We acknowledged that the placement of the lake pump was not fully clarified in the original property divisions, she said. There appears to have been an oversight. I let her finish, then leaned forward. An oversight. You built on land you didn't own, then fined me into the ground for years while trespassing on my property. That's not an oversight. That's arrogance. Martin jumped in. Look, we understand this situation has been tense, but we believe we can reach an agreement. Something fair. I didn't say anything, just waited. He cleared his throat. The board would like to propose a lease. $1 per year. You grant us access, and will formally recognize your ownership of the land. I tilted my head. You think I turned off the lake for $1? Silence. Then I said, here's my proposal. 1. The HOA formally acknowledges, in writing, that the lake pump and utility system sits on my property. 2. Any access must be pre-approved in writing. Trespassing will result in legal action. 3. The HOA reimburses me for past trespasses at a reasonable flat rate, let's say $5,000. And 4. All outstanding fines against me, every single one, are erased. They stared at me like I had grown 2 heads. That's not realistic, Susan said. It's not negotiable. I replied. They left without shaking my hand. I knew it wouldn't be the end, but they were running out of moves. Later that week, I received another letter. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a lawyer representing a group of homeowners, not the board. A group had formed. They were tired of the chaos, tired of the secrecy, and tired of a board that answered to no one but itself. They were filing a petition to remove the current HOA board. I hadn't even asked for that, but apparently, my stand had inspired others. The fish weren't the only things that had floated to the surface, so had years of pent-up frustration. With enough signatures, the board could be dissolved and replaced. And as it turned out, people were more than happy to sign. 3 weeks later, at a special election held in the very community center where they used to hand out fines, the board was removed. Susan gone. Martin gone. That third guy, still no idea who he was. The new board was made up of actual neighbors, people who listened, people who waved at you without writing you up for mailbox violations. And one of the first things they did, they came to me. Not with threats, not with ultimatums, with respect. We drafted a real agreement. They agreed to pay a modest monthly rent for the pump location. They offered to reimburse a portion of my legal fees, and they issued a formal letter apologizing for the previous board's actions. One they mailed to every resident in the neighborhood. But that wasn't even the best part. The new board implemented real change. They revised the bylaws, stripped out the nonsense, gave residents more voting power and transparency. No more secret meetings, no more aesthetic police. Just common sense rules that kept things nice without turning everyone into enemies. In the lake, we turned the pump back on together. I even invited a few kids over to help press the switch. The water took a few days to rise, but it returned, slowly and steadily, like a tide washing away the past. Sometimes I sit on my back porch now and stare out over the lake. Peaceful again, with dragonflies skating along the surface and ducks back in their little flotilla, and I think about how all of this started. With a flower pot, with a leash, with a few inches of grass. It wasn't about the water. It was about control. About people who forgot that power isn't meant to be hoarded, it's meant to be earned, shared, and respected. They thought they could push me around, but I pushed back. Not with fists, not with screaming, with a switch. And when I turned off that lake, I didn't just take away their view. I reminded everyone in Willow Ridge who really held the power. Not the board, not the bullies, but the people.